December 1st, 1945, the air in Aversa, Italy, was biting and damp, carrying the bitter chill of a war that had officially ended, but still haunted the European continent. Inside a stark, unheated holding cell, former General of the Infantry Anton Dostler sat on the edge of a narrow cot. He was a man who had once commanded tens of thousands, a proud officer of the German Wehrmacht, but on this morning, he was simply a condemned man waiting for the sun to rise. He meticulously adjusted his uniform. It had been stripped of the eagle, the swastika, and the gleaming insignia of his rank, leaving only the ghost of his former authority outlined in faded wool. This was the final human moment of a commander who realized that the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich could no longer protect him. He laced his boots in absolute silence, knowing that within the hour he would be marched out to a wooden post driven deep into the Italian soil. Hundreds of miles away, in the bombed-out city of Nuremberg, the grandest legal theater in human history was just getting underway. The surviving architects of the Nazi regime, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, were sitting in a meticulously constructed courtroom surrounded by international press, translation headsets, and a small army of lawyers. The Allied powers wanted a public spectacle to document the atrocities of the Holocaust and the waging of aggressive war. They wanted the rule of law to triumph over the rule of force, but the frontline commanders of the American military, men cut from the same uncompromising blood and guts cloth as General George S. Patton, had a very different view of justice when it came to battlefield atrocities. For these battle-hardened generals, putting a uniformed officer on a global stage for murdering captured American soldiers was an insult to the dead. They did not need a panel of international judges to tell them what constituted murder. The American military tribunal system operating in the Mediterranean and European theaters was designed to be swift, merciless, and completely devoid of civilian legal theatrics. If a German commander executed American prisoners of war in cold blood, the frontline generals believed he did not deserve the courtroom in Nuremberg. He deserved the firing squad, and Anton Dostler was about to become the stark, bloody proof that the United States Army was willing to bypass the international tribunals to deliver immediate, fatal retribution. The global stakes were immense. The Allies were attempting to rebuild a shattered world on the foundation of international law. Yet here, in a muddy courtyard in Italy, a military commission had quietly ordered a general to be shot at dawn. To understand the grim inevitability of the firing squad waiting for Anton Dostler, one must look back to the dark, moonless night of March 22nd, 1944. The brutal Italian campaign was bogged down, turning the peninsula into a meat grinder for Allied forces. In an effort to break the German supply lines, the Office of Strategic Services, the legendary predecessor to the CIA, launched Operation Ginny II. 15 highly trained elite American commandos, led by First Lieutenant Vincent Russo, slipped into the freezing waters of the Ligurian Sea. They paddled their rubber boats toward the hostile shoreline near the small coastal town of Framura. Their objective was as simple as it was dangerous: penetrate behind enemy lines and dynamite a critical railway tunnel that the German army was using to funnel ammunition, supplies, and reinforcements to the heavily contested front lines. These 15 men were not spies operating in civilian clothes. They were fully uniformed soldiers of the United States Army, armed, equipped, and operating under the recognized rules of land warfare. For 2 grueling days, the commandos navigated the treacherous rocky terrain. They moved like ghosts through the heavy Italian brush, carrying heavy packs of high explosives, desperately trying to evade the dense network of German coastal patrols. But the fortunes of war are deeply unforgiving. A sudden change in weather, a missed rendezvous, and sheer bad luck conspired against the American team. Before they could plant a single charge on the railway tunnel, they were spotted by a group of Italian fascist militiamen working in tandem with the German army. Outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from any hope of reinforcement or extraction, the 15 Americans recognized that fighting would only result in a futile slaughter. Following the established protocols of war, They surrendered. They handed over their weapons, expecting to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. They were transported to a local holding facility and subjected to intense, aggressive interrogation by German intelligence officers. Despite the harsh treatment, the true nature of their mission was quickly discovered. The local German commander, recognizing that these were regular American soldiers executing a sabotage mission, prepared to transfer them to a dedicated prisoner of war camp. At that exact moment, the 15 young Americans believed they had survived the worst. They believed they would wait out the remainder of the conflict behind barbed wire. They had no idea that their capture had just triggered a chain of communications that would reach the desk of General Anton Dostler. On March 24th, 1944, a teleprinter chattered to life inside the headquarters of the German 75th Army Corps. The message, decoded and rapidly passed up the chain of command, detailed the capture of the 15 American commandos. General Anton Dostler, a career military man who had served the German state since the days of the Kaiser, sat at his desk and reviewed the report. The local commander requested instructions on where to send the American prisoners. Under normal circumstances, the bureaucratic machinery of war would have processed them without a second thought. But these were not normal circumstances. Hovering over every German commander like a dark, suffocating cloud was the Kommando Befehl, the infamous Commando Order, issued personally by Adolf Hitler in late 1942. The Commando Order demanded that any Allied forces captured operating behind German lines on sabotage missions were to be completely stripped of their rights as prisoners of war. They were to be slaughtered to the last man, without trial, even if they were in full military uniform and attempting to surrender. The order was a blatant, undeniable violation of the rules of war. It was illegal under every international treaty Germany had ever signed. Dostler knew this. His subordinate officers knew this. When Dostler drafted the order to execute the 15 Americans, his own staff pushed back. A junior officer, a man named Alexander zu Dorner-Schlobitten, vehemently refused to transmit the execution order, risking his own life by pointing out that shooting uniformed prisoners was a war crime. Dostler was faced with the ultimate moral and professional crossroads. He could ignore the Führer's illegal directive, spare the lives of 15 young men, and risk his career, his freedom, or perhaps his own life by defying Berlin. Or he could hide behind the shield of military obedience, sign a piece of paper, and wash his hands of the bloodshed. Dostler chose the path of least resistance. He dismissed the dissenting officer, brought in another subordinate who was willing to follow instructions, and transmitted the fatal order back down the chain of command. The directive was clear, concise, and devoid of any humanity. The Americans were not to be transferred. They were not to be treated as prisoners. They were to be taken out the following morning and shot. The morning of March 26, 1944, broke over the rugged Italian coastline at Punta Bianca with a cold, indifferent beauty. The 15 American commandos were roused from their cells. They were not read any charges. They were not presented before a military judge. They were simply marched out of their holding area and loaded into the back of transport trucks. As they bounced along the winding coastal roads, the realization of what was happening began to settle over the men. When the trucks ground to a halt near a desolate rocky precipice overlooking the Ligurian Sea, the grim truth became undeniable. The German soldiers ordered them out, their rifles leveled, their faces hard and unreadable. The Americans were lined up in a row. There was no last-minute reprieve, no dramatic rescue, and no mercy. The German firing squad raised their weapons. The volley of rifle fire echoed sharply against the cliffs, drowning out the sound of the crashing waves below. 15 young men from places like New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania slumped into the dirt, their lives extinguished, not in the heat of battle, but in a cold, calculated act of murder. To compound the atrocity, the German command attempted to erase the crime from history. The bodies of the American soldiers were hastily thrown into a shallow, unmarked mass grave. The dirt was pushed over them, and the German forces went about their day, assuming that the chaos of the collapsing Italian front would keep the secret buried forever. But the Office of Strategic Services did not forget their missing men. When radio contact with the Ginny II team was permanently lost, the American military apparatus slowly began to turn its gaze toward the Italian coast. In the brutal mathematics of war, casualties are expected, but disappearances without a trace breed a specific kind of cold fury. Word eventually trickled out through Italian partisan networks that a group of Americans had been captured and executed. As the Allied armies relentlessly pushed north, breaking the German lines and liberating the towns along the coast, the American military police and OSS investigators followed closely behind the advancing tanks. They were not just looking for territory, they were hunting for ghosts. They were searching for the exact location of the mass grave, and more importantly, they were hunting for the name of the man who had signed the death warrant. By May 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich lay in absolute ruin. The colossal war machine that had terrified the globe was reduced to smouldering rubble, and the once arrogant masters of Europe were suddenly reduced to desperate fugitives. General Anton Dostler, like thousands of his peers, was swept up in the massive Allied dragnet. He was captured by the Americans and transferred to a prisoner of war camp, likely believing that he would be treated with the quiet dignity afforded to high-ranking officers, destined to write his memoirs in a comfortable retirement. But Dostler underestimated the relentless forensic determination of the United States military. While he sat in a holding camp, American investigators in Italy finally located the rocky bluff at Punta, Bianca. The mass grave was unearthed. The bodies of the 15 commandos were positively identified, still wearing the remnants of their American uniforms, the ultimate proof that they were lawful combatants, not spies. This gruesome discovery ignited a firestorm of outrage within the American High Command. The investigation rapidly accelerated. Captured German documents were seized by the ton, and military translators worked around the clock, tracing the bureaucratic paper trail of the Ginny II mission. It did not take long for the web to tighten. The execution order was found. At the bottom of the page, unmistakable and damning, was the signature of Anton Dostler. When confronted by American interrogators, Dostler did not deny signing the order. Instead, he deployed the defense that would soon echo through the halls of Nuremberg. He was simply following orders. He argued that the Commando Order came directly from Adolf Hitler, and as a soldier, it was his absolute duty to obey his supreme commander. If he had refused, he claimed, he would have been shot himself. For the Allied legal teams preparing for the grand civilian trials in Germany, this defense presented a complex philosophical puzzle about the nature of sovereignty and military duty. But for the uncompromising American generals overseeing the military tribunals in Italy, men who viewed war through the brutal binary lens of right and wrong, Dostler's excuse was worse than cowardice. It was an insult to the uniform. The American command decided right then and there Dostler would not be shipped off to the intellectual debates of Nuremberg. He would face a purely military tribunal composed entirely of American officers who had just spent 3 years fighting and bleeding against the German army. In October 1945, the Palace of Justice in Rome was transformed into a theatre of swift, unyielding military law. Anton Dostler was brought before a United States military commission. This was not the civilian spectacle of Nuremberg. There were no grand philosophical speeches about the future of mankind. This was a room full of combat veteran American officers sitting in judgment of a German general. Dostler's defense attorney pleaded for his life, heavily leaning on the argument of superior orders. He argued that the commission was retroactively applying laws that did not exist in the German command structure, and that executing Dostler for obeying his head of state would set a dangerous precedent for all soldiers. Globally, the American tribunal listened, and then they systematically tore the defense to shreds. The prosecution argued that no soldier, regardless of rank, is required to obey an order that is fundamentally and blatantly illegal. The laws of war, specifically the Hague and Geneva Conventions, which Germany had signed, superseded any domestic command issued by Adolf Hitler. The execution of surrendered, uniformed prisoners was murder, plain and simple. The American generals on the panel did not waver. They represented a military ethos that demanded accountability. They knew that if they accepted the superior order's defense, no German officer would ever be held responsible for the millions of innocent lives extinguished during the war. Every man would simply point his finger at the man above him, all the way up to a dead dictator in a bunker. The trial lasted just 5 days. The verdict was unanimous. Anton Dostler was found guilty of war crimes. The sentence was death by musketry. There would be no hanging, the traditional method for common criminals. In a grim nod to his status as a soldier, Dostler would be granted the military death of a firing squad. His appeals were quickly routed through the military chain of command, ultimately landing on the desks of the highest-ranking American generals in the theater. They did not commute the sentence. They did not delay it for the Nuremberg prosecutors. They signed off on the execution, sending a chilling, unmistakable message to the thousands of German officers waiting in POW camps. The uniform will not save you, and the excuse of following orders dies today. We return to the bitter cold morning of December 1st, 1945, in Aversa, Italy. General Anton Dostler stepped out of the holding facility and into the muddy courtyard. The mist clung to the ground as he was escorted by heavily armed American military police. A wooden execution post stood alone in the center of the yard. Dostler maintained his military bearing, walking with a stiff, prideful posture that betrayed none of the terror that must have been racing through his heart. Newsreel cameras were positioned around the perimeter. The American military wanted this execution filmed, photographed, and distributed to the world. They wanted every surviving Nazi functionary and every citizen of the newly liberated Europe to witness exactly how the United States Army dealt with war criminals. Dostler was positioned against the wooden post. An American soldier stepped forward and tightly bound his arms to the wood. Another soldier approached and draped a black canvas hood over the general's head, plunging his world into final darkness. Across the courtyard, a firing squad composed of 12 American soldiers brought their M1 Garand rifles to their shoulders. The silence in the courtyard was deafening, broken only by the sharp, authoritative commands of the squad leader. Dostler did not beg for his life. He simply waited in the dark. The command was given. The volley cracked through the crisp morning air with devastating violence. The impact tore through the general's chest, instantly ending his life and slumping his lifeless body against the ropes. The execution of Anton Dostler occurred exactly 3 weeks after the opening statements at the Nuremberg Trials. But while the civilian lawyers in Germany were still debating the legal definitions of war crimes, the American military command had already delivered their verdict in blood and gunpowder by ordering a German general shot at 6 a.m. instead of sending him to a comfortable courtroom. The frontline generals established a permanent, unyielding precedent. The United States military declared to history that obedience to a tyrant is not an alibi for murder. Anton Dostler paid for the 15 lives of the Ginny II commandos with his own, dying not as a decorated hero of the Reich, but as a condemned man tied to a post, swallowed by the violent history he helped create.